What was the worst year for film? Easy. 1453. Although it had some significant events like the fall of Constantinople and major advancements in the printing press, the film scene was a little too quiet. Okay, we had to make that joke, but in all seriousness, when looking at the worst years in film history, it's a little more difficult than just doing the opposite of what you do when you want to find the best year. You can't just look for the year that released the worst films. Every year has terrible films, many of which go unseen. But if that was the criteria, then 2003 deserves a nod with classics like The Room, Gigli and The Cat in the Hat. Instead, we're looking at the years with lackluster lineups that didn't reach the heights that most usually do, whether it's with their blockbusters or Oscar-nominated films. We found 4 years that really stood out, and 3 of them have a valid reason for being considered one of the worst, whether it's due to some global event, advancements in technology, or changes in the film industry. So let's get started by getting the obvious one out of the way first. The year 2020. 2020 was always going to have a difficult time matching 2019, which had Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, Knives Out, Little Women, Endgame, The Irishman, and just so much more. And you can't forget Parasite sweeping the 2020 Oscars. A foreign movie winning Best Picture was unheard of and made us optimistic about where the film industry will go in the new decade. Well, what we got instead was a global pandemic that would last the next 3 years. With movie theaters being a natural super spreader, it meant that the film industry would take a huge hit. Theaters were closed for most of the year with only short periods where restrictions were lifted. Most film festivals suffered the same fate with many cancellations, postponements, and restrictions. The closure of cinemas lost the global box office billions of dollars because studios pushed their films out of 2020 and put many film productions on hold. And no one knew how long the pandemic would last, so these film delays happened incrementally. A Quiet Place Part 2 premiered in early March of 2020 with a full release scheduled later that month. But it got delayed multiple times before finally getting its theatrical release in May of 2021. Over an entire year later. But No Time to Die's delay, which pushed it out of April 2020, had everyone joining in on the delay train. Black Widow, Dune, Eternals, F9, and not only blockbusters but also The French Dispatch, Last Night in Soho, West Side Story, and Nobody. But lo and behold, one film was ready to stand up against the pandemic. Tenet. Originally delayed from its July release, the long-awaited Christopher Nolan film would take on in August what every other film this year was afraid of. And it flopped hard. Tenet was a lesson for the industry and many more delays followed soon. What was left behind made up a very hollow year for film. Sure, there were still some great movies like Soul, Palm Springs, Minari, and Another Round, with many films coming to streaming and theaters simultaneously to still have a viable 2020 release. But you can't argue the lack of quality films had this year. Take a look at the 2020 box office. 2 foreign movies topped the worldwide numbers. This was the first time a foreign film was the top grossing movie of the year, and the first time since 2007 that the top grossing film earned less than $1 billion. And it wouldn't be until No Way Home at the end of 2021 to break that $1 billion mark again. It's even funnier when you look at the domestic box office, where you'd see films that would have never even dreamed of being in the top 10. To cap off 2020's film calendar, Wonder Woman 1984 managed to squeeze in at the end, a fitting end to the year's blockbuster lineup. The Oscar nominations still ended up being alright, but that was because they extended the eligibility date range to February 28th and reduced the theater screening requirements. Even though it's not one of the 4 years we are calling the worst, 2021 does deserve an honorable mention. It was an improvement over the previous year, but it was feeding off of 2020's delays. And it still had so many of its own delays because of COVID and the halted film productions. Avatar 2, Doctor Strange 2, The Batman, Dungeons & Dragons, and Top Gun Maverick were all supposed to come out in 2021 but got pushed back another year or two. It wouldn't be until 2022 before we'd get a return to form. For the next worst year in film, we're going all the way back to the year 1929. It was during that year where technology advanced and we got sound and talking in film, commonly known as talkies. Although already seen in 1927, it was not until 1929 where talkies became the industry standard. The problem was that it flipped the industry on its head, needing a few years to find its stride again in this revolutionized form. In the previous years, silent films became a mature art form and released some of their best films during that time, such as Sunrise, Metropolis, Napoleon, and A Passion of Joan of Arc. Warner Brothers released the first all-talking film, Lights of New York, in 1928, turning their $23,000 budget into $1,252,000 worth of revenue. What was once considered a fad in 1927 soon had every studio rushing in. By February of 1929, the last of the 8 major studios from Hollywood's golden age, Columbia Pictures, released their first talkie. Studios were throwing money at anyone who could create talkies for them, really trying to rush them out into theaters. By adding sound to film, everything from a technical and creative standpoint was changed, which was very difficult to overcome. Now add studio pressure on top, and it's no surprise why 1929 had no great films. There were 3 things that needed to be sorted out to return the film medium to its glory. The first was technology. Cameras were very loud back then and needed to be in a soundproofed cabinet while filming. The actors also had to stay within a certain range of the microphone, severely limiting their movement to be very unnatural. But in the following years, technology and techniques advanced, so they started using camera casings that suppress noise, along with boom mics and directional microphones to help combat the sound recording limitations. It's actually all very interesting what they had to go through. My favorite scene in Babylon goes over these difficulties so well. We'll leave a link in the description. It's very funny and stressful, so definitely check it out. And Babylon covers this entire transition to sound extremely well, including the next difficulty the industry had to overcome: the talent. More specifically, the actors. The silent era in its short life had many established Hollywood stars by the end of it, but this transition to sound didn't go so smoothly for many of them. Actors without stage experience fell behind, like Norma Talmadge. Others with heavy accents were also at risk, like German actor Emil Jannings, and sometimes their voices were just awkward, as was the case with John Gilbert. These 3 and so many more faded quickly into obscurity as new stars emerged to replace them, many of which came from musical theater. This left 1929 as that awkward year where the majority of people involved with making films didn't really know what they were doing, including the film creators themselves, which was the third challenge to overcome. Silent films reached an aesthetic peak in the late 1920s, and this made the early years of talkies really stand out as having a drop in quality. Some of the top creators like Buster Keaton were eager to explore sound in film, only for studios to strip them of creative control. But many of the best directors were very hesitant at first when it came to talkies, even looking down on them. Back then, Alfred Hitchcock believed that silent pictures were the purest form of cinema, and that the early attempts of sound films were just photographs of people talking. Even though 1929 was the year sound films took over, it wouldn't be until April of 1930 when the first well-received sound feature film was released, The Blue Angel, which was a German film. That same month, we get the first critically acclaimed American talkie, All Quiet on the Western Front. Then later that year, another great German talkie, West Front 1918. But then the following year, we got what is considered as the first talkie masterpiece, M. And again, it was a German film. Talkies began hitting their stride, with more directors jumping on board and experimenting with different uses of sound in film. But the one year that was sacrificed for all of this to happen was 1929. Okay, let's move on to maybe the most relevant worst year in film, 2009. Yes, we love Inglourious Basterds, Up, and Fantastic Mr. Fox, but just like the 2 years we already covered, the lackluster lineup is quite noticeable. 2008 wasn't exceptionally great either due to the same reason: the writer's strike of 2007 to 2008. On November 5th, 2007, the Writers Guild of America went on strike. 12,000 film and television screenwriters took part in this strike, halting the majority of the industry's screenwriting. Their demands? Increased DVD residuals, new residuals from digital and on-demand media, and reality TV jurisdiction. The strike would go on for 100 days, ending on February 12, 2008, and resulted in losses between $1.5 and $2.1 billion. And because screenwriting is one of the earliest parts in the filmmaking process, the effects of the strike wouldn't be experienced until the latter half of 2008 and 2009, at least for film. TV actually took a much bigger hit from the strike, where we saw so many shows being delayed, having their seasons shortened, and being cancelled. Even things you wouldn't expect, like talk shows, were shut down, where we saw Conan O'Brien come back on air fully bearded during the strike and filled his airtime with many unscripted shenanigans. And unlike in 2020, where films were delayed but the quality was still there the years after, the 2007 strike ruined some films. The strike delayed and rushed many film productions. Some films had to rush their scripts because they knew a strike was imminent. This even led to sometimes filming with unfinished scripts. This was the case with these 5 blockbuster films. Yes, Quantum of Solace is a 2008 film, which is why that year also gets a mention. But the other train wrecks were all from 2009. Quantum of Solace had both director Mark Forster and Daniel Craig working with a bare-bones script, knowing that they were kind of screwed from the start. X-Men Origins Wolverine also had an unfinished script that needed many changes while filming, but there were no writers on set. Ryan Reynolds, who was already attached to the Deadpool character before that film, saw how poorly they wrote the character and made changes on the fly. His parts in the original script were just written as Wade Wilson shows up, talks really fast. Transformers: Revenge of the Fallen had the writers finish the film's treatment right before the strike started, leaving it up to director Michael Bay to expand it into something, and for writers to later on make his work into a usable script. The G.I. Joe 2 writer actually managed to finish the script in time before the strike, but it really needed some more time to bake. It ended up hindering G.I. Joe's chances of becoming a successful franchise. And Terminator Salvation has Christian Bale still resenting it to this day, who only signed up because of Jonathan Nolan being attached to the script. But due to the strike, Nolan dropped out. These were just some of the most popular examples of the effects the strike had, but it really affected the industry across all budget levels. The reason we say this is the most relevant worst year is because of 2023's writer's strike coupled with the actor's strike, the first actor's strike since 1980. But unlike the strike from 2007, this one focuses on increased residuals from streaming, job security, and the limited use of AI. Only time will tell the long-term impacts of the strike, but we've already seen delays across both the film and TV industry, like Dune Part 2 and Beyond the Spider-Verse. 2023 was already an awesome year, so I don't think we have to worry about it too much, but who knows? Maybe 2024 or 2025 will be the new contenders for worst year in film history. But honestly, let's hope not. Major film studios have said that they have enough films to steadily release until mid-2024, giving them some leeway. But with many film productions on standby, I don't think they have enough room to feel safe. And now for our final worst year. Sometimes there's just no real reason for the uninspiring film lineup, and that's 2005. When doing research, this year came up an odd amount of times, but I don't think it was unwarranted. For starters, Crash won Best Picture, which is widely considered the worst Best Picture winner ever. So having that film represent the year does not give 2005 a good look. The Best Picture nominees weren't too great either, with their average quality looking worse than most Best Picture nominees, even after the Academy increased the nomination limit. Just look at this page of 2005 films. There's not much that sticks out as something truly great when compared to a year like 2007, for example. And don't get me wrong, I'm not some 2005 hater. Here are just 10 of the films I really liked from that year. But come on, look at these 2007 films. Sure, you had Revenge of the Sith memes, but Spider-Man 3 memes were almost as good. 2005 is also one of the few years that doesn't have a film on the Letterboxd Top 250, the only year in its decade. It wasn't a good year for the box office either, being down 5.5% from 2004 and also having some disappointing blockbusters that were highly anticipated, such as War of the Worlds and King Kong. Some people are pretty vocal about lumping 2006 along with it as the worst, but 2006 had some top films. But I get why people are quick to point at the 2000s as the worst years. This was the era of Hollywood's bad sequels and hollow prestige films. The 2000s had an overcorrection back to big budget films after the indie boom in the 90s, but by the mid-2000s we were in the thick of it. Franchises were being created and revived left and right. We saw the birth of the Hollywood we know today, minimizing risks and creativity to maximize profits. Of the top 50 grossing films of the decade, only 9 were not based on another property. And only 3 of those weren't animated, so it's easy to see why everyone is so sour about this part of film history, especially the mid-2000s, and even more so 2005 that didn't release enough great original films to offset these issues. So I guess we did end up finding a reason for 2005 after all. And those are what we believe to be the worst years in film history. But before we end off, how about a few more dishonorable mentions? 2011's Best Picture lineup was a bit lame, and the top 10 at the box office was filled with some critically panned films. But Drive was pretty cool though. 1970 doesn't have too many standouts either, at least not for Hollywood. And then there's an article MTV wrote ranting about how 1987 was the worst year for film, doing it differently than us by focusing on the worst films to come out in a year. And of the 5 year in film history videos we've done so far, we think 1992 was the worst of the bunch with the least films to really stand out. So there you have it, 4 of the worst years in film history with a few more sprinkled in. Thanks for watching. We really hope you found this video entertaining and informative. We want to hear from you. What do you think was the worst year in film history? Was it one we missed? Leave your comments down below. Make sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and check out our Patreon for more content and some cool perks if you want to support us more there. And until next time, have a good one.